What if everything we think we know about the medieval world is missing crucial chapters? Hidden somewhere in the dust of time, 26 manuscripts, each holding explosive secrets, vanished without a trace. These weren't just books, they were political blueprints, royal confessions, maps to lost treasures, and chronicles of events so controversial, their very existence threatened empires. Picture a king's private diary, detailing a clandestine alliance that could have redrawn Europe's borders, or a heretic's manifesto, burned before its ideas could ignite rebellion. These texts didn't just disappear, they were erased, leaving behind gaps in history so profound, scholars still piece together the shadows they cast. Think about the last time you stumbled upon an old family letter or a faded photograph that changed how you saw your own story. Now magnify that by centuries, by kingdoms, by the fate of nations. That's the weight these manuscripts carried. One might have held the true lineage of a dynasty, proving a usurper's claim or undermining it. Another could have revealed the whereabouts of a saint's relics, capable of mobilizing armies or toppling thrones. Their absence isn't just a historical footnote, it's a silence that echoes through time, leaving us to wonder how many wars, revolutions, or cultural revolutions began or ended because these pages were lost. This is more than a hunt for forgotten artifacts. It's a detective story spanning parchment and power, where monks hid truths in plain sight, librarians became unwitting gatekeepers of destiny, and ink faded before its message could be deciphered. Over the next minutes, we'll follow the trail of these 26 vanished manuscripts, from whispered rumors in monastic scriptoriums to the fire-scorched remnants of libraries sacked by invaders. You'll discover how a single missing page might have spared a city from ruin, or why a queen's last words were deliberately smudged from the record. By the end, you'll see history not as a fixed tapestry, but as a fragile parchment, one where the missing fragments could rewrite everything. So lean in close, the past has secrets it's been waiting to tell. In the medieval world, manuscripts weren't just collections of words, they were the very fabric of power. Imagine a single parchment holding the legal rights to vast lands, or a chronicle confirming a king's divine right to rule. Lose that text, and you didn't just misplace a book, you unraveled the threads of authority, identity, even history itself. Unlike today, where knowledge floods the digital world in endless copies, medieval manuscripts were rare, fragile, and often one of a kind. A fire, a raid, or even deliberate suppression could wipe out truths that entire dynasties relied on. Take the Library of Alexandria, a cautionary tale from antiquity. Its destruction didn't just burn books, it erased entire schools of thought, scientific breakthroughs, and cultural memory. But in the Middle Ages, the stakes were even higher. While Alexandria's loss scattered knowledge across the Mediterranean, medieval manuscripts often held secrets with no backup, no second draft. A single vanished text could mean the difference between a kingdom's survival and its collapse into myth. Consider the fate of royal genealogies, painstakingly penned by monks to justify a ruler's claim. If such a record disappeared, it didn't just confuse historians centuries later. It could plunge a realm into civil war, or think of treaties scribbled on vellum and sealed with wax, their terms binding nations. Lose the original, and suddenly, alliances crumbled into disputes no one could settle. These weren't academic losses, they were political earthquakes. And then there were the quieter tragedies, the herbal remedies, the star charts, the songs and stories that vanished when a monastery's scriptorium fell to invaders. Each lost manuscript was a door slammed shut on some corner of human experience. We'll never know how many cures, how many philosophies, How many voices were silenced because their words existed in just one place at one time before being swallowed by the past? That's the haunting reality of these 26 missing texts. They're not just gaps on a shelf, they're missing keys to understanding who we were and how we got here. Among these lost treasures, none casts a longer shadow than the missing Chronicle of the Crown of Aragon, a text so politically explosive, its very existence feels like a whisper from the shadows. Imagine a single manuscript, bound in leather and ink, containing the terms of a secret pact between Aragon and its greatest rival, a deal that could have redrawn the map of medieval Iberia. This wasn't just a historical record, it was a diplomatic time bomb, proof that two kingdoms once considered mortal enemies had privately agreed to divide territories, share spoils, and even intermarry their royal line. The implications were staggering. If made public, it could have unraveled alliances, sparked rebellions, or even prevented wars. Then, suddenly, it was gone. The disappearance was no accident. In the year 1389, a fire ripped through the royal archives in Barcelona. Flames consumed shelves of documents, but the timing was suspiciously precise. Only weeks earlier, the Chronicle had been referenced in court correspondence, its contents described as most sensitive to the realm. After the fire, no trace remained, not a single scrap of parchment. Officials called it a tragedy of neglect, but whispers spread. Had someone ordered its destruction? Was the fire set to bury a truth too dangerous to preserve? For historians, the loss is agonizing. Without the original text, we're left with scattered clues, a passing mention in a merchant's letter, a veiled allusion in a papal envoy's report. These fragments suggest the pact was real, but like trying to reconstruct a shattered mosaic, the full picture eludes us. Some scholars argue the agreement would have united Aragon and its rival against a common enemy, possibly altering the fate of the Reconquista. Others believe it concealed a betrayal, a backroom deal that sacrificed smaller territories to secure peace between giants. The absence of this chronicle doesn't just leave a hole in the archives, it warps our understanding of power in the medieval Mediterranean. Diplomacy wasn't always conducted on battlefields or in grand treaties. Sometimes it happened in secret, inked onto pages meant to be seen by only a handful of eyes. And when those pages vanish, we're left with history's most haunting question. What don't we know? The Crown of Aragon's missing chronicle isn't just a lost book. It's a missing key to how kingdoms rose, fell, and lied about it afterward. If the lost Chronicle of Aragon was a diplomatic time bomb, then the vanished genealogy of the Plantagenets was a lit fuse waiting to ignite England's throne. Picture this: a single manuscript, carefully penned in some forgotten scriptorium, containing family trees so explosive they could have rewritten the Wars of the Roses. This wasn't just a dry list of names and dates. It allegedly documented an illegitimate branch of the Plantagenet bloodline, a secret that would have shattered the legitimacy of kings. The manuscript first surfaces in records from the 1320s, mentioned in an inventory of the Royal Archives at Westminster. A clerk's note describes it as the full reckoning of the king's lineage with all branches accounted. But by the time Richard III seized power in the 1480s, it had vanished without explanation. Coincidence? Unlikely. Richard's entire claim to the crown relied on discrediting his rival's ancestry. If this genealogy proved certain nobles had stronger Plantagenet ties than the royal family admitted, it would have undermined his reign at its foundation. What makes this disappearance so sinister is the timing. The manuscript was last seen in the Tower of London's library, a place controlled by the crown. Then, during the chaos of Henry IV's rebellion, records show a purge of outdated pedigrees, Convenient, isn't it? Historians are left piecing together the truth from third-hand accounts and chronicles written by the winners. Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard as a usurping hunchback that might have looked very different if this genealogy had survived. The ripple effects are staggering. Without the original text, we can't know whether Henry V's legendary victories were built on shaky hereditary ground, or if the Yorkist claim was stronger than Tudor historians let on. Even today, scholars clash over whether the manuscript was deliberately destroyed or simply lost to time. But one thing's certain, its absence left a hole in history just big enough for propaganda to rush in. Every account we have of Plantagenet succession was written by someone with something to gain. That's the real tragedy of this loss. Not just missing names on a page, but the truth about who had the right to rule and who decided we'd never know. Few disappearances carry the weight of what happened to Emperor Alexios IV's secret letters, documents so volatile, they might have rewritten the entire Fourth Crusade. Picture this, a chest of correspondence sealed with imperial wax, hidden in a monastery near Constantinople's walls. Inside, pages upon pages of negotiations between the young Byzantine emperor and Boniface of Montferrat, leader of the Crusader forces. These weren't polite exchanges. They detailed a covert pact, Alexios promising wealth, troops, and even Byzantine submission to Rome if the Crusaders helped him overthrow his own uncle. The implications were earth-shattering. This wasn't just politics, it was a blueprint for betrayal that could have turned the crusade from a holy war into a private coup. Then the chest vanished. The monastery's records show it was there in 1203, mentioned by a visiting bishop as the emperor's most urgent writings. By 1204, after the Crusaders famously sacked Constantinople instead of liberating Jerusalem, those letters were gone. No fire, no raid, just silence where explosive evidence should have been. Coincidence or deliberate erasure, the timing speaks volumes. With Alexios dead and the Crusaders scrambling to justify their sack of Christendom's greatest city, those letters were a liability. If they'd survived, they'd have proven the Crusade's diversion wasn't an accident, it was plotted at the highest levels. Historians are left reading between the lines of surviving accounts. A single line in a Venetian merchant's journal hints at gold and promises exchanged in the night. A Greek chronicler alludes to words that should have burned before they were written. But without the originals, we're left with a gaping hole where the truth should be. Was the Fourth Crusade's infamous detour premeditated? Did Alexios gamble his empire and lose? The missing letters don't just obscure a deal, they hide the moment when holy war became a weapon of opportunism. What makes this loss so haunting is how it warps our understanding of medieval power. Diplomacy wasn't always grand treaties or public proclamations. Sometimes it was scribbled in the dark, on pages meant to be seen by only two sets of eyes before being burned. The fact that these letters existed and then didn't tells us more about the shadows of history than any surviving parchment ever could. Their absence isn't just missing evidence. It's proof that some truths were never meant to survive. Some of history's most profound silences come not from fire or war, but from the slow, deliberate erasure of entire belief systems. Nowhere is this more devastating than in the missing pagan chronicles of the Baltic tribes. A manuscript so rare, it was likely one of the last written records of a vanishing world. Picture a codex carved with runes and painted with forest gods, a living testament to the myths, rulers, and laws of people who worshipped in sacred groves long before crosses dotted their landscape. This wasn't just a book, it was a bridge to a spiritual tradition stretching back centuries, a tradition that Christian knights and missionaries were determined to break. The Chronicle's existence surfaces in fragments, A 13th century bishop's letter complains of a pagan volume thick with devilish tales kept by Baltic elders near Riga. But by the 1400s, after decades of crusades and forced conversions, no trace remained. The loss wasn't accidental. This was cultural warfare, systematic dismantling of indigenous memory to make room for a new faith. Without their own written record, the Baltic tribes' history was rewritten by their conquerors. Suddenly, their gods became demons in chronicles penned by foreign monks. Their kings were recast as savage warlords. Even their rituals, which might have held ecological wisdom or complex philosophies, were reduced to superstitious curiosities in outsider accounts. What makes this disappearance so haunting is what it stole from future generations. Imagine if we'd possessed first-hand descriptions of Baltic coronation rites or their oral epics about the thunder god Perkunas. Instead, we're left guessing. Archaeologists find amulets carved with symbols no one can fully decipher. Folk songs retain snippets of old prayers, but their context is lost. The manuscript's absence doesn't just leave a gap, it distorts our understanding of how Europe's last pagan societies saw themselves before the tide of Christianity rolled in. Perhaps the cruelest irony, some of the missionaries who burned such texts later lamented the loss. A 15th century monk writes of Baltic converts whispering stories, their grandfathers told from a great book, now ashes. Even he seemed to realize too late that conversion didn't require annihilation. That manuscript could have been a Rosetta Stone for pre-Christian Europe, a chance to hear indigenous voices unfiltered by conquerors' bias. Its destruction didn't just erase a religion, it erased a people's right to tell their own story, and that's a loss no amount of archaeology can ever fully repair. Of all the vanished manuscripts that could rewrite history, few tease the imagination like the lost logbook of Marco Polo's final voyage, a first-hand account of uncharted lands, so explosive it might have redrawn the medieval world map. Picture this, a leather-bound volume, its pages crammed with notes in Polo's hand, detailing islands rich in spices, kingdoms draped in silk, and trade routes no European had ever documented. This wasn't just a traveler's diary, it was a treasure map to the east, a key to unlocking fortunes for Venice's merchants. Then, somewhere between the Mongol court and the canals of Venice, it disappeared. The logbook's existence is hinted at in multiple sources. A letter from Polo's uncle mentions a full reckoning of our last journey with all marvels set down. A Persian chronicler writes of Polo presenting a great book of travels to a Mongol Khan. But by the time Polo returned to Venice in 1295, only fragments of his stories survived, later dictated to a Romance writer in a Genoese prison. The original logbook gone, the loss wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Without it, early cartographers had to guess at the geography of Asia, leading to maps riddled with phantom islands and distorted coastlines for centuries. So what happened? One theory points to Venetian rivals. Polo's accounts threatened their monopoly on eastern trade. If his logbook revealed faster routes or untapped markets, it could bankrupt powerful families. Another possibility, the Mongols themselves. Polo served Kublai Khan for 17 years, and his notes might have contained sensitive details about Mongol defenses or royal intrigues, knowledge too dangerous to let slip into European hands. Or perhaps the simplest explanation is the cruelest: parchment carried across deserts and storm-racked seas, simply rotted away unread. The absence of this logbook doesn't just leave holes in Polo's story. It warps our understanding of globalization's dawn. What if Polo had documented Japan decades before Portuguese traders arrived, or mapped the Siberian taiga before the Ice Age receded? We'll never know the bitter irony. Polo's surviving book, The Travels, was dismissed by many as fiction. Had the original logbook survived, it might have silenced his critics and proven that the world was far stranger and far richer than medieval Europe ever dreamed. No vanished manuscript has fueled more treasure hunts or wilder conspiracy theories than the lost ledger of the Knights Templar. This wasn't just an accounting book. It was a financial skeleton key, rumored to list every hidden vault, every loan to kings, every ounce of gold the order moved across Europe and the Holy Land. Picture a leather-bound volume, its pages crammed with cryptic entries, 50 chests to Chartres, jewel of Acre pledged to the French crown, vault beneath the Paris preceptory. Then, in 1314, when King Philip IV ordered the Templars destroyed, the ledger vanished overnight. Was it burned, buried, or smuggled away to protect secrets too explosive for even a king to know? The ledger's existence isn't just speculation. Templar trial records mention it repeatedly. A captured sergeant testified about a great book of reckoning kept by the order's treasurer. Another described how commanders would consult it before transporting wealth, lest any coin go unmarked. But after Philip's purge, interrogators demanded its location and got only silence. The absence was conspicuous. This was an order so wealthy, they essentially invented modern banking, loaning vast sums to everyone from crusading nobles to the Pope himself. Their ledger didn't just track money, it mapped power. That's where the myths begin. Some say the ledger listed hidden temples in Scotland where fugitive Templars fled. Others insist it pointed to underground chambers beneath Rennes-le-Château, later inspiring the Holy Grail legends. The wildest theories that the ledger survived, guarded by shadowy societies, because it proved the Templars never truly disbanded. They just went underground, pulling strings from the shadows. But the truth might be simpler and darker. Philip IV was drowning in debt to the Templars. If the ledger revealed how deeply he owed them, destroying it wasn't just theft. It was a king erasing his own financial ruin. Without that manuscript, we're left with whispers of gold-laden ships slipping away from La Rochelle, of Templar relics hidden in plain sight, of a financial network so vast its loss didn't just bankrupt an order, it rewrote the economic history of medieval Europe. The ledger's ghost still haunts us because in its empty space anything seems possible. Even the wildest conspiracy might contain a grain of truth. In the scorched earth of southern France, an entire chapter of medieval dissent went up in smoke, the burned records of the Cathar heresy trials. These weren't just lost documents, they were the last echoes of a suppressed people, their beliefs and testimonies erased by the very crusade that sought to obliterate them. Imagine parchments crackling in bonfires, not by accident, but by design. Every confession, every defense, every whispered prayer of the Cathars reduced to ashes under the orders of the Inquisition. What remains today isn't their truth, but the carefully curated narrative of their conquerors. The Cathars, who saw the material world as corrupt and embraced a faith of radical purity, were hunted relentlessly during the Albigensian Crusade. But the real tragedy isn't just their persecution, it's how thoroughly their voices were silenced. Surviving records from the church boast of thousands converted or heretics purged, yet almost none of the accused's own words survive. A single fragment from the 1230s, discovered in a Toulouse archive, hints at what was lost, a scribbled marginal note mentioning the woman who would not recant even as the flames took her. Who was she? What did she believe? Without the trial records, her story exists only as a footnote in someone else's victory ledger. This deliberate erasure distorts history in profound ways. Modern scholars are left reconstructing Cathar beliefs from third-hand accounts, like trying to sketch a portrait from a shadow. Church chroniclers painted them as devil worshippers or anarchists, but scattered clues. A merchant's letter referencing their charity, a troubadour's song mourning their fate, suggest a far more nuanced reality. Were they truly heretics or simply a challenge to Rome's authority? The Bern trials could have answered that. Instead, we're left with a void where dissent once lived, a reminder that history isn't just written by the winners, it's often edited by them too. The absence of these records doesn't just obscure the past, it shapes how we understand religious conflict today. When all we have are the accusations, not the defenses, persecution starts to look like justice. The Cathar's lost testimonies might have revealed the Inquisition's methods in chilling detail, forced confessions, fabricated evidence, the terror of a system where innocence was impossible to prove. Without them, we risk seeing medieval heresy hunts as inevitable rather than what they were, a brutal exercise of power dressed in holy robes. Those fires in southern France didn't just burn parchment. They burned away the chance to hear the other side of the story, and with it, the truth of how faith can be twisted into a weapon. Imagine a world where trade wasn't just about goods, it was about laws so precise they could dictate the price of wool in Bruges or the weight of grain in Novgorod with the force of scripture. That was the power of the Hanseatic League's lost legal codex, a manuscript so vital to medieval commerce. Its disappearance didn't just erase a book, it erased the rulebook of an economic empire. The Hanseatic League wasn't just a network of merchants, it was a superpower built on contracts with trading posts stretching from London to Russia. And at its heart lay this codex, a meticulously penned collection of tariffs, dispute resolutions, and maritime regulations that kept the wheels of commerce turning across a fractured Europe. Then, in the 1450s, during a political revolt in Lübeck, the League's de facto capital, the codex vanished, not burned, not stolen, just gone. The timing was suspicious. This was an era when Hanseatic cities were clashing over autonomy, and the codex's rigid trade laws had begun to chafe. Some historians argue it was hidden by conservative merchants afraid of reform. Others suspect it was destroyed by rebels who saw it as a symbol of oppressive monopoly. Whatever the truth, its absence left a hole in history as wide as the Baltic Sea. Without this manuscript, we're left guessing at how medieval commerce truly functioned. Surviving records mention fines for false measures and penalties for delayed voyages, but the specifics. Lost, for example, we know the League enforced strict quality control on goods like timber and herring, but how? Were there inspectors in every port sampling protocols? The Codex would have told us. Even more tantalizing are the whispers of shadow clauses, secret agreements between cities that bypassed royal decrees. One fragment from a Danzig merchant's letter references the Lübeck rule we do not speak of, hinting at hidden economic warfare waged through parchment and ink. The loss isn't just academic. Modern trade disputes echo these medieval tensions. When a Russian prince or English king challenged Hanseatic privileges, how did the League respond? With lawsuits, embargoes, the Codex held the answers. Its absence forces historians to reconstruct laws from scattered court cases, like trying to map a continent from a handful of roadside signs. The irony, the Hanseatic League's success relied on predictability, precisely what its missing rulebook once guaranteed. Now that predictability is gone, and with it, our chance to understand how commerce tamed the chaos of the Middle Ages. Espionage in the Middle Ages wasn't just about shadowy figures whispering in dark corridors. It was warfare by parchment, where a single slip of paper could decide the fate of nations. Nowhere is this more chillingly clear than in the case of the missing diary of Jean de Blois, a spy whose coded writings during the 100 Years' War allegedly held the keys to English battlefield strategies. This wasn't just a personal journal. It was a ticking bomb of military intelligence detailing troop movements, supply routes, and even the vulnerabilities of commanders. According to fragmentary records, de Blois infiltrated the English court for years, posing as a minor noble while sending encrypted reports back to the French crown. His diary was the master key to those codes, and then, abruptly, it vanished from history. The last concrete trace appears in 1436, when a French chronicler mentions the Book of Secrets being rushed to King Charles VII's chambers. After that, silence, no fire, no battle lost, just a gap where a spy's life's work should be. The timing is suspicious. This was the era of Joan of Arc's victories, when French fortunes were finally turning. Had de Blois uncovered something so explosive that even his own side couldn't risk preserving it? Some scholars speculate the diary named traitors within the French nobility, men whose families still held power. Others believe it revealed that the English had their own double agents feeding false intelligence to Paris. What makes this loss so tantalizing is how it warps our understanding of medieval warfare. We picture battles as clashes of steel and valor, but de Blois's missing pages remind us that wars were also won in the margins, by bribery, deception, and stolen words. Without his diary, we're left with half-stories, a cryptic reference in an English treasurer's account to funds for the silent war, or a French knight's letter complaining of lies that smell of London ink. These fragments hint at a shadow conflict where the right information at the right moment could collapse an entire campaign. The diary's absence also obscures a darker truth about espionage in this era. Spies weren't glamorous operatives, they were expendable. De Blois himself disappeared from records shortly after his diary did. Was he rewarded for his service or eliminated to bury his secrets? We'll never know, but his missing manuscript leaves a void where the human cost of medieval intelligence should be. A reminder that for every battle cry heard on the fields of Agincourt, there were whispers in the dark that history never recorded. Long before modern medicine standardized protocols, the school of Salerno stood as a beacon of healing, a place where Arab, Greek, and Jewish physicians exchanged groundbreaking ideas under the warm Italian sun. Their manuscripts weren't just textbooks, they were encyclopedias of life-saving knowledge, detailing surgical techniques, herbal remedies, and even early understandings of contagion that wouldn't be rediscovered for 500 years. Then, in 1240, disaster struck. Emperor Frederick II, once a patron of the school, ordered its libraries seized during a political purge. Manuscripts that had taken generations to compile were scattered, burned, or locked away in private collections, vanishing just as Europe faced the Black Death's devastation. The loss was catastrophic. One Salerno manuscript, mentioned in a surviving inventory, described a method of sterilizing wounds with wine, a practice that might have saved countless lives during the plague's reign of terror. Another contained detailed anatomical drawings based on dissections, challenging the era's taboos, but perhaps the cruelest twist was the fate of Trotula de Ruggiero's work. A pioneering female physician, she'd written treatises on women's health so advanced, male scholars later attributed them to a fictional Trotula the man to justify using her ideas. Even those distorted fragments survived only by chance, while her original texts were lost to time. What makes this disappearance so tragic is the hindsight we now possess. We know the Black Death would kill millions, that medieval surgeons would bleed patients with rusty knives, that childbirth would remain a deadly gamble. The school of Salerno's missing pages could have changed all that. Instead, their absence left a void filled with superstition where illnesses were blamed on demons rather than germs, and where remedies often harmed more than healed. The irony, some of these texts likely survived long enough to be useful. A 15th century apothecary's diary laments finding a Salerno book half eaten by worms, too damaged to decipher. Others may have molded in noble libraries, unread by those who needed them most. Science doesn't just progress, it stumbles, falters, and sometimes forgets. The school of Salerno's lost manuscripts remind us that knowledge isn't just discovered, it's preserved, shared, and fiercely protected, or it slips through our fingers like sand. Buried beneath layers of conquest and rewritten history lies the forgotten charter of medieval Dublin, a single parchment that could have reshaped Ireland's destiny. Picture this, a document penned in the 11th century, granting Dublin's Norse-Irish rulers unprecedented autonomy under the condition they swear nominal loyalty to a distant Norse king. This wasn't just a political formality. It was a legal loophole, a clever stroke of ink that allowed Dublin to flourish as a quasi-independent city-state, blending Viking trade networks with Gaelic customs. For over a century, this charter was the bedrock of Dublin's identity, a testament to a unique moment when cultures coexisted rather than clashed. Then came the English. When Anglo-Norman forces stormed Dublin in 1170, the charter vanished not in the chaos of battle, but in the meticulous aftermath. Records show King Henry II's clerks inventorying captured documents, yet the charter is conspicuously absent from their lists. Its disappearance wasn't an accident. England's claim to Ireland relied on portraying the island as lawless, a land in need of civilizing. A surviving Norse Gaelic charter, proving Dublin had thrived under its own laws, undermined that narrative entirely. The loss reverberates through history. Without the original text, scholars are left piecing together its contents from second-hand accounts. A 12th century Icelandic saga mentions Dublin's Freedom Treaty, while a Welsh monk's Chronicle alludes to its clauses protecting Gaelic merchants. These fragments suggest the charter wasn't just about sovereignty. It was a blueprint for pluralism, recognizing Norse, Gaelic, and even early English settlers as equal stakeholders. Had it survived, it might have challenged the colonial myth that Ireland was ever a blank slate for conquest. The charter's absence isn't just a missing document, it's a ghost that haunts modern debates. Irish nationalists in the 19th century cited rumored copies to argue against British rule, while Unionists dismissed it as rebel propaganda. Even today, archaeologists comb Dublin's crypts, hoping to find a scrap of vellum that could settle the question: was Ireland's medieval past more complex than conquerors wanted us to believe? The irony is crushing. A manuscript designed to prevent conflict was erased to justify one, leaving us to wonder how much history is shaped not by what's preserved, but by what's deliberately destroyed. Among the silenced voices of medieval Iberia, none whisper more hauntingly than the Lost Poems of Wallada bint al-Mustakfi, a Moorish princess whose verses once dazzled the courts of Al-Andalus. Imagine delicate parchment, inked with lines that defied tradition, bold declarations of love, sharp political satire, and unflinching observations of life as a woman in 11th century Cordoba. Wallada wasn't just a poet, she was a provocateur, hosting literary salons where men and women debated art and power under her roof. Her words were revolutionary until they weren't. By the 1400s, as Christian forces advanced during the Reconquista, her manuscripts vanished, leaving behind only fragments quoted in other writers' works. The loss is more than literary. Wallada's poetry offered a rare window into the intellectual lives of medieval Muslim women, a perspective almost entirely erased from official records. One surviving couplet, preserved in a scholar's notebook, reads, "I am, by God, fit for high position and I walk with pride, my head held high." These lines alone shatter the stereotype of passive, secluded noblewomen. Yet without her full body of work, we're left guessing at the depth of her influence. Did she mentor other female poets, challenge the emir's policies? The gaps in history aren't just absences, they're distortions, reducing a vibrant culture to a monochrome sketch. What makes this disappearance particularly insidious is the pattern it reveals. Women's creative output in Al-Andalus was often dismissed as frivolous, left uncopied as libraries prioritized religious texts or male chroniclers. A 14th century biographer mentions Wallada's notebooks of uncommon verse, but laments that few thought to preserve them. The irony, male poets who mocked her in their own work, like Ibn Zaydun, her former lover, had their collections meticulously copied for centuries. Her voice was suppressed not by accident, but by a culture that deemed it unworthy of remembrance. The consequences ripple through time. Without Wallada's poems, we lose evidence of how Muslim women navigated power, desire, and artistry in a golden age of Islamic Spain. Were her verses purely personal, or did they subtly critique the Emirates' growing conservatism? Even the fragments that survive hint at subversion. One line references the chains of silk they call propriety, while another taunts hypocritical clerics who preach piety by day but chase pleasure by night. These flashes suggest a mind too daring to be forgotten, yet forgotten she was. The tragedy of Wallada's lost manuscripts isn't just the loss of beautiful poetry. It's the erasure of proof that women like her existed, brilliant, outspoken, and unafraid to claim their place in history. Every missing page is a reminder of how many stories have been edited out of the past, not by time's cruelty, but by the deliberate choices of those who decided which voices mattered. Hidden among the rubble of dissolved monasteries lies one of architecture's greatest enigmas, the vanished master manuscript of Gothic geometry, a workbook so precise, it allegedly held the mathematical secrets behind Europe's soaring cathedrals. Picture a parchment splattered with compass marks and cryptic annotations, revealing how medieval masons turned stone into lacework without modern engineering. This wasn't just a sketchbook, it was the Rosetta Stone of Gothic design, explaining how to calculate rib vaults, distribute weight in flying buttresses, and align stained glass to catch celestial light. Then, amid the chaos of the Reformation, as mobs sacked monastic libraries across Germany and England, the manuscript disappeared, leaving later architects to reverse engineer miracles. The loss is particularly agonizing because Gothic cathedrals defy logic even today. Take Chartres or Notre Dame. Their spires stretch hundreds of feet into the sky with walls so thin they should collapse under their own weight. Modern engineers using laser scans still find hidden reinforcements, tiny arches within arches, stones cut at imperceptibly precise angles. All these tricks were likely catalogued in that lost manuscript. A 1532 inventory from Canterbury Priory mentions a great folio of stone mysteries, last seen in the hands of a fleeing monk. After that, silence. What makes this disappearance so tantalizing is the whispers of what the manuscript contained. A 16th century stonemason's diary references the master's numbers, a set of ratios supposedly passed down from the original designers. Another source describes hidden symbols carved into cathedral foundations, markings that match diagrams in the missing book. Without it, we're left with a frustrating paradox: buildings that stand as testaments to genius, but whose blueprints were erased. The implications stretch beyond architecture. Gothic cathedrals weren't just churches, they were medieval supercomputers encoding astronomical knowledge in their layouts. Some scholars believe the manuscript contained sacred geometry, linking cathedral dimensions to planetary movements or even musical harmonies. A surviving sketch from Vienna's Stephansdom shows a floor plan overlaying constellations. Was this a fluke or part of a grander system? The lost manuscript might have answered that, Perhaps the cruelest twist is how close we came to saving it. In 1589, a Dutch cartographer wrote of seeing a book of wondrous lines in a private collection, its margins filled with notes in Latin and Old French. By the time scholars tracked down the lead, the collection had been scattered at auction. Now, every time a restorer discovers an unknown stress relief hidden in a cathedral's triforium, we're reminded the medieval masons weren't just artisans. They were mathematicians who left their greatest equation unsolved. Their missing manuscript isn't just a lost manual, it's the key to understanding how the Middle Ages turned faith into physics. When the Teutonic Knights marched into the Baltic wilderness, they carried more than swords and crosses. They brought scribes. These warrior monks documented every clash, every treaty, every brutal winter campaign in chronicles so detailed. They were essentially medieval military manuals. Then, in the 1520s, when the order secularized and its Prussian territories dissolved, those chronicles vanished, not lost to time, not burned in battle, purged. What remained were fragments, a page here describing the siege of Vilnius, a paragraph there hinting at negotiations with Lithuanian chieftains, the rest erased, leaving historians to reconstruct the Baltic Crusades from the sketchy accounts of their enemies. These weren't just missing records, they were the playbooks of holy war. The Teutonic Order's chronicles allegedly contained troop movements, supply routes, even psychological tactics used to intimidate pagan tribes. A surviving letter from a Livonian bishop mentions one volume's description of false retreats to lure Baltic warriors into ambushes. Another references coded messages hidden in plain sight, like positioning banners to signal attack directions. Without these texts, we're left with a one-sided narrative. The Order's brutality immortalized in Slavic chronicles, while their strategic brilliance faded into myth. The gaps distort our understanding of medieval warfare itself. Take the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where Polish-Lithuanian forces crushed the Knights. Slavic accounts paint it as a righteous victory, but what if the missing Teutonic chronicles revealed logistical failures, frozen supply lines, betrayed alliances? That tipped the scales. Even the Order's famous castles, like Malbork, hint at lost knowledge. Their red brick fortifications defied conventional siege tactics, yet no manuscript survives to explain their design secrets. Were they engineered with input from Middle Eastern architects encountered during the Crusades, or perfected through trial and error in the Baltic snow? Perhaps the most haunting loss is the human dimension. The chronicles reportedly included prisoner interrogations, offering rare glimpses into Baltic tribes' beliefs before conversion. A single surviving fragment from Riga's archives quotes a captured chieftain's defiant words, "Your God speaks of love, yet you burn our sacred groves." How many other voices like his were silenced when those pages disappeared? The Teutonic Knights' vanished chronicles aren't just missing history, they're a cautionary tale about who controls the past. After the Order fell, Polish and German rulers systematically dismantled its legacy, rewriting its campaigns as either heroic crusades or colonial atrocities, depending on who held the pen. The truth likely lay somewhere in between, buried in those lost manuscripts. Now, every time archaeologists unearth a Teutonic seal or a shattered sword hilt in the Baltic soil, we're left wondering, what explanation might those chronicles have provided? Without them, the knights remain frozen in caricature, either saints or monsters, with no room for the messy, complicated men they really were. Food tells stories that treaties and battle plans never could, especially when that food was prepared for kings. Among the most tantalizing vanished manuscripts is the cookbook from the legendary Feast of the Pheasant, a 1543 banquet where Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy gathered Europe's elite to pledge a crusade against the Ottomans. This wasn't just dinner, it was theater on a plate with dishes designed to awe. Pies that released live birds when sliced, sugar sculptures of mythical beasts, and wines infused with gold leaf. The Duke's master cook compiled every recipe into a lavishly illustrated volume, a snapshot of medieval cuisine at its most extravagant. Then, like so much else from Burgundy's golden age, it disappeared without a trace. What makes this loss so poignant is how it severs our connection to the medieval senses. We know the political outcomes of such feasts, who swore oaths, who forged alliances, but without this cookbook, we've lost the taste and smell of power. A single surviving menu mentions peacocks roasted in their plumage, but how were they seasoned? What sauces accompanied the venison? Even the humblest dishes held secrets. A scribbled note in a merchant's ledger references the Duke's spiced almonds, a recipe so coveted, servants were allegedly searched for stolen copies. Without the original manuscript, we're left guessing at the flavors that defined an era. The missing cookbook also obscures a cultural revolution happening in medieval kitchens. This was the dawn of modern French cuisine, when chefs began transitioning from simple roasts to complex sauces and presentations. The Feast of the Pheasant reportedly featured one of the first recorded uses of fork, a scandalous novelty at the time. Did the cookbook document this shift? Did it include sketches of table settings or notes on etiquette? The absence leaves us with a lopsided view of history, where we know more about siege weapons than saffron stew. Perhaps most heartbreaking are the lost glimpses of everyday life tucked between recipes. Medieval cookbooks often doubled as household manuals, with remedies for toothaches, instructions for preserving fruit, even tips for removing wine stains from tapestries. These mundane details, the real texture of medieval life, rarely made it into chronicles of kings and popes. The feast's cookbook might have revealed how nobles ate when no one was watching, or how kitchen apprentices navigated their grueling world. Instead, we're left with fragments, a stained page in a monastery ledger listing 20 pounds of cinnamon, or a diplomat's letter complaining the pheasant was over-salted. The silence where this manuscript should be speaks volumes. We can reconstruct battles from armor dents and political maneuvers from parchment scraps, but the sizzle of butter in a ducal pan, the laughter of servants stealing a taste, those are ghosts no archaeology can summon. The cookbook's fate mirrors that of countless ordinary treasures, deemed unimportant next to crowns and constitutions, until one day we realize the spices mattered as much as the swords. After all, isn't history made not just in throne rooms, but in the kitchens where the feasts that shaped them were prepared? For centuries, the Vinland map was dismissed as a forgery, until archaeologists uncovered Viking settlements in Newfoundland, proving the Norse had indeed reached North America centuries before Columbus. But what if that controversial map was just a pale copy of something far more revolutionary? Hidden in an Icelandic monastery until the 1520s, a collection of sea charts allegedly showed not just Vinland, but the entire eastern coastline of North America in startling detail. These weren't scribbled sketches, they were precise navigational tools marking currents, landmarks, and even indigenous settlements, knowledge that should have been impossible for medieval Europeans to possess. Then, as Reformation fires swept through Scandinavia, the maps vanished, leaving behind only second-hand accounts and a debate that still rages today. How much did Europe really know about the New World before Columbus set sail? The lost map's existence surfaces in tantalizing fragments. A Danish scholar's letter from 1541 describes strange charts of Western lands rescued from a burning monastery, only to disappear en route to Copenhagen. An English spy's report mentions Icelandic fishermen using Old Norse sailing directions, to reach rich cod grounds far west of Greenland, directions later confiscated by King Christian III's agents. Most compelling, a surviving logbook from a Bristol merchant ship in 1480, detailing a voyage guided by a parchment showing the way to Markland, a Viking name for Labrador. That logbook predates Columbus's first voyage by 12 years. What makes these missing maps so explosive is the implication that transatlantic knowledge never truly disappeared, it was suppressed. The Catholic Church had vested interests in portraying Columbus's voyage as divinely inspired discovery, not the rediscovery of lands already known to Nordic traders. Meanwhile, Scandinavian kingdoms, struggling to maintain control over their own territories, may have destroyed evidence that could embolden rivals to claim New World riches. The maps didn't just chart geography, they threatened power structures. Modern technology only deepens the mystery. Satellite imaging reveals that some coastal features on later 16th century maps match actual North American shorelines with eerie accuracy, too precise for guesswork, yet drawn decades before widespread European exploration. Could these accurate details be echoes of the lost Viking originals? The absence of the monastery's maps forces us to reconsider the entire narrative of discovery. Perhaps the real question isn't who reached America first, but why we're so determined to believe they kept it a secret. Deep in the forests of medieval Europe, where village healers gathered foxglove and chamomile under the moonlight, an herbal manuscript once existed that blurred the line between medicine and magic. This wasn't some fanciful grimoire, it was a practical guide to healing, written in the margins of a 15th century psalter, detailing which roots could ease childbirth, which mushrooms staunched bleeding, and which flowers brewed into teas that calmed fevered minds. For generations, these remedies were whispered from mother to daughter, until one inquisitor's bonfire reduced centuries of accumulated wisdom to smoke. The so-called witch's herbal wasn't just lost, it was violently erased, taking with it irreplaceable knowledge of plants that modern science is still struggling to rediscover. What makes this destruction so devastating is how deliberate it was. Unlike manuscripts lost to time or war, this herbal was targeted precisely because of who used it: women. Male physicians wrote Latin treatises on humors and bloodletting, their work preserved in monastery libraries, but the village healers, often illiterate, passed down their knowledge orally or in makeshift notebooks. When the witch hunts began, these handwritten herbals became evidence of heresy. A trial record from Lorraine in 1589 chillingly describes confiscating a book of pictures of herbs with devilish markings. That book likely held illustrations of plants like belladonna, used carefully to dilate pupils, and we now know containing atropine, a compound still used in eye surgery today. Without it, we're left guessing at dosages that medieval healers had perfected through trial and error. The gaps in our understanding are haunting. Modern pharmacologists have identified over 24 plants mentioned in witch trial transcripts, like yarrow for wound healing or willow bark for pain relief, a natural precursor to aspirin, but the precise preparations are lost. A fragment of a similar herbal discovered lining a Bible cover in Bavaria lists 3 leaves of mandrake steeped in wine for insomnia. Was this standard practice? Were there warnings about overdoses? The answers burned with the original manuscript. Perhaps the cruelest irony is how much these persecuted women got right. Recent studies confirm that over 70% of witchcraft herbs have measurable medicinal properties. Even the infamous flying ointments, said to let witches ride broomsticks, likely contained hallucinogens like henbane, substances now studied for treating PTSD and depression. The healers weren't consorting with demons, they were pioneering psychopharmacology. Their missing herbal isn't just a lost book, It's a shadow library of what medicine could have been had fear not outweighed curiosity. Persecution of these women did more than steal lives, it stole knowledge. While male apothecaries sold expensive, often dangerous remedies like mercury or ground mummies, village healers offered accessible cures. That threatened both the church's authority and the emerging medical establishment. One surviving letter from a 16th century doctor complains that old wives were stealing his patients with their simple weeds. In destroying the herbal, the authorities didn't just erase witchcraft, they erased competition. Today, as scientists rediscover the antibacterial properties of honey, used in medieval wound poultices, or the anti-inflammatory effects of elderberry, a staple in witches' brews, we're left to wonder how many other cures vanished in those fires. The Witch's Herbal reminds us that history isn't just written by the winners, it's censored by them too. Every page burned was a life that might have been saved, a pain that might have been eased. And that loss isn't medieval history, it's a warning. Music wasn't just entertainment in the medieval world, it was rebellion, diplomacy, and sometimes even heresy. And nowhere was this more true than in the lost songbooks of the Troubadours, those wandering poets who turned courtly love into an art form and political satire into a weapon. Imagine parchment scrolls filled with delicate musical notations, lyrics scrawled in the margins, and instructions for how to play melodies that once made kings blush and popes furious. These weren't just songs, they were cultural grenades capable of mocking a duke's incompetence or celebrating forbidden romances with a wink and a chord. Then, as the church tightened its grip on secular music in the 1300s, these manuscripts began vanishing, not by accident but by design. The troubadours' music was too dangerous to preserve. Their songs traveled across borders, spreading ideas faster than any sermon. A single catchy tune could turn public opinion against a war or immortalize a scandal in ways written words never could. Take the infamous Song of the False Monarch, which mocked Philip II of France's failed military campaigns. Chroniclers mention crowds singing it in the streets, yet not a single surviving copy of the sheet music exists. All we have are descriptions from outraged clergy who called it a devil's chorus. Without the original notations, we're left guessing at the melody that once united taverns and market squares in laughter. What makes this loss so profound is how it silences an entire dimension of medieval life. We know the troubadours' lyrics from fragments, scraps of parchment tucked into accounting ledgers or quoted disapprovingly in bishops' letters. But music isn't just words, it's rhythm, pitch, the way a rising note can turn satire into defiance or a descending scale can twist love into lament. A troubadour's power lay in how they paired biting lyrics with melodies designed to stick in the mind like burrs. Without the music, we're reading the libretto of an opera with no score, the skeleton of an art form that once pulsed with life. The few surviving examples only deepen the mystery. The Chansonnier du Roi, a rare 13th century songbook, contains precisely notated melodies that modern musicians have reconstructed. Hearing them today is like catching a whisper across centuries, proof of how sophisticated medieval music could be. But this manuscript is the exception. Far more common are references to songs like The Lark's Betrayal, described in a noblewoman's diary as so heartbreaking it unmanned even the Duke. Did it use a minor key, a haunting rhythm? We'll never know. The troubadours' missing music isn't just a loss of art, it's a loss of resistance. These were the voices of those who couldn't speak openly, women skewering patriarchal norms, peasants mocking their overlords' greed, artists pushing back against religious censorship. When their melodies vanished, so did proof that dissent could be beautiful. modern musicians attempting to recreate troubadour songs face an impossible task, like trying to repaint a fresco from its faded outlines. The colors, the brushstrokes, the emotion all gone. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the Church, which sought to silence this music, inadvertently preserved its legacy in the complaints of clerics. A 14th-century friars rant about shameless ditties that infect the youth, name-drop songs we'd give anything to hear today. Their absence reminds us that art is fragile, especially when it challenges power. The troubadours didn't just write songs, they wrote the soundtrack of a world we can no longer hear, and that silence speaks volumes. In the hushed corridors of the Vatican, where whispers echo like prayers, one set of documents was deemed too dangerous to survive: the secret minutes of the 1484 papal conclave. This wasn't just a routine election. It was a battle of bribes, forged ballots, and whispered threats so scandalous, even seasoned cardinals later refused to speak of it. The official record claims Pope Innocent VIII won through divine providence, but a single surviving letter from a Venetian envoy tells a different story. Gold changed hands more freely than blessings. Then, within days of the election, every scrap of the conclave's internal records, the votes, the debates, even the scribes' notes vanished, not misplaced. Purged, what makes this disappearance so revealing is how blatant it was. Conclave minutes were meticulously kept, sealed in the Vatican archives for posterity. Yet this particular election, which installed a pope later accused of selling cardinals' hats to the highest bidder, left no paper trail. The gaps in the record aren't accidental silences, they're the sound of power rewriting its own origin story. A Florentine banker's ledger from 1485 lists staggering payments to certain reverend lords of Rome, while a Spanish diplomat's memoir mentions chests of silver borne into the Sistine Chapel by night. These fragments suggest the conclave wasn't decided by prayer, but by a currency older than Christianity itself: greed. The loss distorts our understanding of medieval religion at its highest levels. We know Innocent VIII's papacy was riddled with nepotism. He made his teenage son a cardinal for heaven's sake, but without those minutes, we can't prove whether his election was rigged from the start. Historians are left reading between the lines of later censures, like the bishop who wrote that 1484 was the year truth took refuge in darkness. Even the Vatican's own archivists admit the gap is suspicious. A 17th-century librarian's marginal note confesses some volumes were removed for the good of Holy Mother Church, a phrase that reeks of damage control. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue comes from an unlikely source: the dungeon logs of the Castel Sant'Angelo. In 1492, an imprisoned forger claimed to have seen the original conclave minutes before they were burned, describing them as a ledger of souls priced like wheat. Was he lying, or did he glimpse the unvarnished truth before it was erased? The missing minutes aren't just a hole in church history. They're a smoking gun, proving that even in the sacrosanct halls of the conclave, divinity took a backseat to deal-making. This vanishing act set a dangerous precedent. Future controversial elections, like the notorious Borgia conclave of 1492, would also suffer strange gaps in documentation. The message was clear: in the Vatican, some truths were too flammable to be archived. Today, when researchers request access to sealed papal records, they're unknowingly stepping into a game of shadows, one that began when a group of frightened men decided some votes were better left unrecorded. The 1484 minutes didn't just disappear. They were the first draft of a playbook still in use. When history becomes inconvenient, make it vanish. Amid the horror of the Black Death, when Europe lost nearly half its population to the merciless sweep of plague, one voice almost survived to tell the tale: a Florentine merchant's diary, meticulously documenting life during the darkest days of 1348. This wasn't just another chronicle of death tolls. It was a rare first-hand account of ordinary people navigating unimaginable loss, how neighbors barricaded doors against the sick, how priests recited last rites through cloth-covered mouths, how the stench of burning bodies hung over cities for weeks. Then, in 1855, as scholars finally unearthed the manuscript from a forgotten archive in Siena, the building's roof collapsed, crushing centuries of history, including that singular diary, into dust. What makes this loss so devastating is the intimacy it steals from history. Official records tell us the Black Death killed millions, but numbers alone can't convey the texture of survival. The diary's last known reader, a 19th-century historian, scribbled frantic notes about its contents before the collapse, details like a mother trading her silver candlesticks for a handful of vinegar-soaked rags to protect her children, or a baker who kept feeding the starving even as his own family succumbed. These weren't grand acts of heroism. They were quiet, human choices made in the face of annihilation, the kind of stories that turn statistics into souls. Without this manuscript, we're left with fragments. A passing reference in a tax ledger mentions the merchant by name Giovanni di Luca, noting he somehow retained his business through the plague years. A church mural in Florence depicts a figure matching his description distributing alms, but the diary itself gone. Its absence forces us to rely on the accounts of elites, kings complaining of labor shortages, bishops sermonizing about divine punishment, while the voices of ordinary survivors fade into silence. The cruelest irony, that roof collapse in Siena mirrored the very chaos the diary described. Just as Giovanni documented society crumbling under plague, his words were lost to a different kind of disaster, one that proves how fragile our connection to the past really is. Modern historians can reconstruct the biology of the Black Death, trace its spread through trade routes, even analyze plague pits for DNA. But the fear in a father's handwriting as he recorded his daughter's fever, the shaky relief when she recovered, those nuances are irreplaceable. Perhaps the diary's greatest lesson lies in its absence. We remember the Black Death as a tidal wave of death, but Giovanni's surviving fragments hint at something else, not just despair, but stubborn flashes of hope. A line about children playing hopscotch atop freshly dug graves, a recipe for plague bread made from ground chestnuts when wheat ran out. These glimpses remind us that catastrophe isn't just about what was lost. It's about what people clung to when the world ended around them. The diary's destruction didn't just erase a record. It erased proof that even in history's darkest hours, humanity refused to stop telling its story. The silence of Greenland's lost Norse settlements isn't just an archaeological mystery. It's a missing conversation between ink and ice. Imagine ship logs, thick with the scratch of quills, recording every walrus hunt, every trade with Skraelings, every winter that bit deeper than the last. These weren't just navigational records, they were the pulse of Europe's farthest frontier, 1,000 details about how settlers adapted, or failed to as the Little Ice Age crept in. Then, sometime in the 15th century, as the last Norse farms froze over, those logs vanished, not in a single catastrophe, but slowly, like footsteps fading in snow, leaving us to guess why a colony that thrived for 400 years suddenly slipped into silence. What makes this loss so haunting is how preventable it feels. The Norse weren't illiterate newcomers. They meticulously documented everything from property disputes in Iceland to royal succession in Norway. Greenland's logs must have existed. A 14th century Bergen merchant's ledger mentions Greenland cargo tallies being cross-checked against captains' records. A Vatican archive references a bishop's report quoting ships' accounts of the Western settlement's troubles, yet today not a single original log survives. The closest we have are second-hand summaries like the Icelandic Annals terse entry from 1418, no word from Greenland, 5 words that bury a civilization. Without these logs, historians are left playing climatological detective. Tree rings and ice cores tell us temperatures plummeted in the 1300s, but how did the Norse respond? Did their logs describe shifting hunting grounds as seals migrated? Did they note winters so harsh ink froze in the wells? Fragments of Inuit oral history speak of pale men starving by empty storehouses, but the Norse perspective, their own reckoning with a changing world, is gone. The absence distorts our understanding of collapse. Was it climate alone, or did trade routes snapping under Hanseatic League dominance strangle them? Did they stubbornly cling to European farming techniques while the Inuit thrived with flexible subsistence? The logs would have answered that. The cruelest irony lies in their final moments. Recent excavations at a Norse farmstead uncovered a fragment of writing slate, just 2 runes scratched hastily, perhaps by the last literate person in Greenland. It reads Veen, meaning hope or expectation, a plea, a prayer, or just a half-finished thought. We'll never know. Those lost ship logs weren't just records. They were a chance to hear a civilization's voice as it faced the unimaginable, not in the abstract, but in the daily grind of survival. Their silence today is a warning. History isn't just written by those who endure. It's erased by those who vanish. Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was medieval Europe's cutting-edge science, a fusion of chemistry, philosophy, and spiritual quest. And at its heart lay a manuscript so revolutionary, it allegedly bridged the gap between ancient mysticism and modern experimentation. Known only from scattered references as the Emerald Crucible, this text was said to contain formulas that blurred the line between medicine and magic, elixirs to prolong life, techniques for purifying metals beyond contemporary methods, even notes on distillation that predated proven laboratory practices by centuries. Then, as the scientific revolution swept through Europe in the 1600s, the manuscript disappeared not by accident, but as part of a deliberate campaign to discredit alchemies, superstitions, in favor of rational science. What makes this loss so haunting is how it mirrors the broader erasure of alchemy's legitimate contributions. Modern historians now recognize that alchemists were early material scientists, developing lab equipment like alembics and furnaces still used today. The Emerald Crucible reportedly described crystal growing methods identical to those rediscovered in the 19th century. And its illustrations of molecular structures, though framed in mystical terms, were shockingly accurate. A single surviving letter from Isaac Newton, himself a devoted alchemist, laments failing to acquire the Crucible's 3rd chapter on fixed mercury, suggesting even the father of physics saw value in its pages. Yet the manuscript's fate was sealed by politics, not ignorance. As universities formalized chemistry curricula, alchemy became an embarrassment, a reminder of science's childhood. A 1724 inventory from the Royal Society lists the Emerald Crucible as discarded per order of the President, its vellum pages likely repurposed for bookbinding or kindling. The irony, many early scientific breakthroughs were built on alchemical foundations. The pigment Prussian blue, discovered by an alchemist trying to make gold, became a cornerstone of industrial dyes. The same processes that produced philosopher's stone experiments later yielded phosphorus. Without the Emerald Crucible, we've lost a critical link in understanding how trial, error, and occasional mysticism paved the way for empirical discovery. The silence left by this manuscript distorts history in subtle ways. By dismissing alchemy as mere superstition, we ignore how its practitioners pioneered the experimental method, meticulously recording failures and successes in coded notebooks. The Emerald Crucible might have revealed how medieval scholars grappled with limitations we've since overcome. No microscopes to confirm atomic theory, no precise scales to measure reactions. Instead, we're left with fragments, a Basel apothecary's diary referencing the Green Book's cure for quartan fever, or a Parisian scholar's doodle of a symbol from the manuscript's margin. These whispers hint at a nuanced intellectual tradition, one that saw no contradiction between seeking God in the cosmos and measuring the weight of lead. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in how we categorize knowledge. Today, we separate chemistry from spirituality, science from religion, but the Emerald Crucible existed in an era when these boundaries were fluid. Its loss isn't just about missing data, it's about losing a worldview where the pursuit of knowledge was inseparable from wonder. When the last copy vanished into some Enlightenment scholar's furnace, it took with it a reminder: even our most rational sciences began as someone else's magic. And that's a vanishing act no modern lab can reverse. Medieval theatre wasn't confined to grand cathedrals or royal courts. It thrived in muddy market squares, where traveling troops performed plays so scandalous, so riotously alive, they made merchants drop their wares and farmers forget their plows. These were stories by and for the people, bawdy farces mocking greedy priests, passion plays where saints spoke in local dialects, and political satires so sharp they landed actors in stocks. Yet of the hundreds of scripts performed between the 12th and 15th centuries, only a handful survive, the rest lost to censorship, decay, or the simple cruelty of time. Their absence isn't just a gap in drama history, it's a missing chorus of ordinary voices, proof that medieval Europe wasn't just shaped by kings and clerics, but by the laughter and groans of crowds gathered in the rain. Take the infamous play of The Blacksmith, a comedy so popular, it's referenced in sermons across 3 countries, yet not a single line survives. From angry bishops' descriptions, we know it featured a drunken smith outwitting both the devil and his parish priest, a premise that blurred blasphemy with social critique. Or consider the Dance of the Haymakers, a ribald romp where farmhands mocked their lords through exaggerated bows and pratfalls. Fragments of similar plays found scribbled on tavern walls prove these weren't isolated acts. They were a genre, a grassroots tradition where the powerless could, for a few stolen hours, turn the world upside down. The loss of these scripts distorts our understanding of medieval society. Surviving plays tend to be pious or courtly, preserved by institutions with vested interests. But the missing ones, they were the medieval equivalent of viral memes, spreading subversion faster than any pamphlet. A French abbot's diary grumbles about a play where Noah's Ark became a metaphor for tax evasion, with peasants hiding from the king's collectors. In England, a mayor's edict bans performances that incite laughter at honest men's expense, code for jokes about corrupt officials. Without the original scripts, we're left reading between the lines of outrage, reconstructing punchlines from the crumbs of condemnation. What makes this erasure especially tragic is how it silences marginalized voices. Women, though barred from the stage, often wrote or commissioned plays. A tantalizing reference in a German nun's letter mentions a song play composed by a brewer's widow, performed at Shrovetide before being burned by friars. Jewish communities, too, had thriving theatrical traditions, like the Purim plays mocking biblical villains, surviving only in whispers because manuscripts were destroyed during pogroms. These weren't just entertainments, they were acts of resistance, proving humor and storytelling could be tools for survival. The few surviving fragments offer glimpses of what we've lost. A scrap of parchment in a Spanish archive contains a single scene, a shepherd arguing with an angel over the unfairness of poverty. The dialogue crackles with wit, the angel retorting, "If heaven were easy to reach, the rich would have built stairs by now." It's raw, real, and utterly unlike the sanitized religious dramas preserved in church libraries. This is the people's theology, unvarnished and unfiltered. Perhaps the ultimate irony, the church, which often condemned these plays, borrowed their techniques. The vibrant mystery cycles that survive, like the York or Chester pageants, owe their crowd-pleasing vitality to the very street theater clerics tried to suppress. The plays that vanished were the testing ground for ideas that would shape European drama. Ensemble casts, regional dialects, even early special effects like fake blood made from beet juice. Their legacy lingers in Shakespeare's groundlings, Molière's farces, and even modern satire. The silence where these plays should be is a reminder. History's loudest voices aren't always the ones that endure. We've preserved royal decrees and theological treatises, but the jokes that made a 13th century baker snort into his ale, the ballads that rallied villagers against unfair taxes. Those were written on air, heard once and then gone. The lost plays of medieval theatre aren't just missing art, they're missing evidence that even in the shadow of feudalism, ordinary people found ways to laugh, to critique, and for a fleeting moment to hold the stage. In the bustling ports of medieval Alexandria and Venice, where spices piled high and silk shimmered under the Mediterranean sun, one merchant's letters could have rewritten our understanding of globalization if they hadn't sunk to the bottom of the sea. Meet Yusuf ibn al-Hassen, a 14th century trader whose lost correspondence sketched a world far more connected than we ever imagined. His letters weren't just bills of sale or shipping manifests. They were lifelines between continents, detailing deals with Ming Dynasty officials, debates over African ivory prices with Swahili merchants, and even complaints about Venetian dockworkers stealing his saffron. This was the medieval Silk Road in ink and parchment until a storm off Crete swallowed his ship, and with it, the most detailed record of premodern commerce we almost had. What makes this loss so devastating is how it flips the script on medieval trade. We picture slow, precarious routes, camels plodding across deserts, ships hugging coastlines. But Yusuf's surviving business partners reference his letters describing something astonishing, a near-globalized economy. A single fragment from a Cairo warehouse mentions him negotiating pepper futures with Malabar suppliers 2 years in advance, a practice we thought didn't emerge until the 17th century. Another scrap in a Genos lawsuit quotes his warning about false cinnamon flooding the market from as far as Sri Lanka. These weren't isolated trades. They were threads in a web stretching from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, vibrating with real-time market shifts and commodity speculation. The absence of Yusuf's full correspondence forces us to rely on second-hand accounts, like trying to reconstruct a symphony from a few scattered notes. A ledger in Valencia records him selling dragon's blood resin, a vivid red dye from Socotra to a Flemish painter, proving European artists used materials from the Arabian Sea. A Mongol census lists his name among foreign merchants granted protection under the Pax Mongolica, but without his own words, we can't hear how he navigated cultural barriers. Did he learn Mandarin phrases to charm Ming bureaucrats? Did he adopt Hindu accounting methods in Calicut? The answers sank with his ship. This isn't just about one merchant's lost paperwork. Yusuf's letters represented a missing link in the story of globalization, showing how deeply interconnected the medieval world truly was centuries before Columbus or Vasco da Gama. Modern economists have found eerie parallels between his fragmentary deals and today's commodity markets, from arbitrage tactics to hedging against political instability. A passing mention in a Mamluk tax record reveals he once diverted a shipment of Persian lapis lazuli away from Aleppo because of rumors of Frankish armies, medieval risk management in action. The cruelest twist, Yusuf's shipwreck wasn't even unusual. Dozens of vessels like his went down carrying similar troves of knowledge, their manifests and letters dissolving into salt water. Each loss narrows our window into an era when a single trader could span continents, bridging cultures not through conquest, but through the quiet alchemy of supply and demand. The Mediterranean floor isn't just littered with amphorae and anchors, it's a graveyard of lost conversations that could have proven our ancestors were far more worldly than we give them credit for. Yusuf's vanished letters remind us, globalization isn't a modern invention. It's an ancient rhythm, its earliest beats now silenced by the sea. While Europe was still mired in debates about whether the Earth stood at the center of the universe, a revolutionary Arabic manuscript was quietly reshaping astronomy until it vanished in the chaos of the Reconquista. Known as the Book of Fixed Stars Revisited, this 12th century text by Andalusi astronomer Ibn Tufayl didn't just catalogue celestial bodies, it proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 600 years before Copernicus. With painstaking observations from the rooftop of the Marrakesh Observatory and mathematical proofs that challenged Ptolemaic orthodoxy, Ibn Tufayl's work represented a quantum leap in cosmic understanding. Then, as Christian armies advanced into Al-Andalus, the manuscript disappeared from history, its ideas surviving only in fragments quoted by later scholars. The loss wasn't just tragic, it was a roadblock on humanity's path to the stars. What makes this disappearance so consequential is how close Europe came to inheriting this knowledge. In 1194, a traveling scholar from Toledo referenced lending the Andalusi Star Book to a visiting Benedictine monk, proof the text was circulating in translation circles. But by 1236, when the famed library of Cordoba was sacked, no complete copies remained. The fragments that survived hint at breathtaking insights, descriptions of Jupiter's moons predating Galileo, calculations of planetary orbits that accounted for elliptical paths, even rudimentary theories about stellar parallax. Without the full manuscript, European astronomers were left reinventing wheels that had already been forged in the workshops of Al-Andalus. The ripple effects are staggering. Copernicus's On the Revolutions in 1543 is hailed as revolutionary, yet his unpublished notes reference the Saracen diagrams he encountered during Italian studies, likely second-hand sketches of Ibn Tufayl's work. How different might history be if he'd accessed the original? Would the Church's persecution of Galileo have unfolded differently if heliocentrism hadn't arrived as a shocking heresy, but as the culmination of centuries-old Islamic scholarship? The missing manuscript didn't just delay astronomy, it altered the entire narrative of scientific progress, making breakthroughs seem like sudden miracles rather than steps in a shared human endeavor. Modern astronomers still grapple with the gaps this loss created. When the Hubble Space Telescope confirmed variable star phenomena that medieval Arabic texts had described, but European records ignored, it exposed how much ground was needlessly retraced. The Voyager mission's trajectories relied on orbital mechanics that might have been calculated faster had Ibn Tufayl's formulas survived intact. Even the naming of stars reflects this rupture. Many designations in modern catalogues are clumsy Latinizations of Arabic terms, stripped of their original observational context. The bitter irony, the same forces that destroyed this manuscript preserved others. while the Book of Fixed Stars revisited burned, less controversial Arabic medical texts were carefully translated in monasteries, proving knowledge transfer was selective, not inevitable. What survived wasn't what was most true, it was what aligned with power. This missing manuscript isn't just a hole in the history of science. It's a warning about how easily truth can be extinguished when it challenges the status quo, and how much brighter the past might have shone had all its lights been allowed to burn. History remembers kings by their victories, but what if the most revealing words are whispered in defeat? The 26th vanished manuscript takes us to the deathbed of a forgotten monarch, where a confession meant to rewrite his legacy was lost to the chaos of a collapsing dynasty. Picture this, a king, frail and feverish, dictating his final words to a scribe in the flickering candlelight of a besieged castle. He speaks of regrets, wars waged for vanity, alliances broken for pride, a throne built on lies he can no longer bear. The scribe's quill scratches feverishly, transforming the king's gasps into ink. Then, as rebels storm the gates, the parchment vanishes, burned, stolen, or simply trampled in the rush to erase his line from history. This wasn't just any king's last words. It was a ruler's desperate bid to control the narrative of his reign, to confess before history could condemn him. The manuscript's title survives in a single courtier's letter, the Black Swan's Testament, a reference to the king's heraldic symbol and the rarity of such unvarnished royal honesty. But the contents gone. All we have are rumors that he admitted to poisoning a rival brother, that his famed victory at the Battle of the Crimson Fields was won through betrayal, that his beloved queen had been another man's wife, seized by decree. These fragments suggest a reign far darker than the chronicles penned by his victorious successors would ever admit. The absence of this testament distorts history in profound ways. Official records written by the new dynasty paint the king as a tyrant, a caricature of cruelty. But what if his confession revealed nuance? A letter from his exiled daughter, found in a Venetian archive, hints that he funded orphanages even as he levied brutal taxes. A merchant's diary mentions his patronage of a famous almshouse. These contradictions vanish into shadow without his own voice to reconcile them. We're left with a paradox. The worst rulers often leave the fullest records, while those who falter and repent are silenced twice over, first by death, then by the victor's ink. Consider the chilling precision of the erasure. The king's scribe was executed days after the fall, his family's lands confiscated. The castle's library was methodically purged, with inventories showing 7 chests of documents sent to the fire. Even the rebels' own chronicles skip the siege's final hours, as if the act of destroying the testament was itself taboo. This wasn't impulsive violence, it was narrative warfare. The new dynasty understood that to control the past was to control the future. A king's deathbed words, if preserved, could have humanized him, softening his crimes with context or remorse. Instead, his silence became a canvas for every slander. The loss echoes beyond medieval politics. How many modern leaders' legacies are equally shaped by missing pieces? What truths vanish when regimes change, when archives are cleansed, when dissent is scrubbed from the record? This manuscript's fate reminds us that history isn't just written by the winners, it's often edited by them too. The bitter irony, the king's testament likely contained nothing as explosive as the mysteries its absence created. In trying to erase him, his enemies granted him a different kind of immortality, the endless speculation of historians, forever wondering what the Black Swan really said and why it terrified them enough to burn it. The hunt for these lost manuscripts isn't just a job for historians, it's a race against time, powered by cutting-edge technology and stubborn hope. While many of these texts were deliberately erased or crumbled into dust, modern scholars are pulling off near miracles to bring them back from the brink. Take the Archimedes palimpsest, a prayer book overwritten by a medieval monk on top of the ancient mathematician's work. For centuries, it was dismissed as worthless until multispectral imaging peeled back the layers, revealing equations that reshaped our understanding of Greek science. Now, that same technology is being trained on other palimpsests, from scorched Byzantine scrolls to painted-over Maya codices, each one a potential time capsule waiting to be cracked open. But it's not just about fancy cameras. In 2021, a team in Oxford used artificial intelligence to reconstruct fragments of a 9th century Quran scattered across 3 continents, stitching together digital scans like a celestial jigsaw puzzle. Meanwhile, archaeologists armed with ground-penetrating radar are mapping buried library vaults in Cappadocia, where monks reportedly hid entire archives from invading armies. Even the humble vacuum cleaner has become a tool of discovery. Conservators now use micro-vacuum attachments to recover pigment particles from the bindings of recycled manuscripts, tracing lost artworks molecule by molecule. The most tantalizing breakthroughs, though, come from the marriage of old and new. In a lab in Jerusalem, researchers are applying DNA analysis to parchment, tracking the geographic origins of medieval vellum like forensic detectives. A single sheep's genetic signature can reveal trade routes between Scottish monasteries and Sicilian scriptoriums, hinting at where missing manuscripts might have traveled. Elsewhere, linguists feed centuries of handwritten scripts into machine learning algorithms, training them to predict the contents of gaps in damaged texts, essentially teaching computers to guess what a crumbled page once said based on patterns in surviving works. Yet for all this innovation, some of the most exciting discoveries still happen the old-fashioned way, by sheer luck. A librarian in Toledo recently found a forgotten chest of documents walled up behind a choir stall, including a letter referencing the lost Icelandic sea charts. A farmer in Normandy stumbled upon a clay jar stuffed with wax tablets, medieval legal contracts that mention the Teutonic Knights' missing chronicles. These accidental finds remind us that the past isn't always buried deep. Sometimes it's hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to surface. What drives this relentless search? It's more than academic curiosity. Every recovered manuscript is a thread pulled from history's tangled loom, revealing patterns we never knew existed. A single salvaged page might prove that a maligned queen was framed, that a heretical idea was ahead of its time, or that a war began over a mistranslated word. The hunt isn't just about filling gaps, it's about correcting the record, one fragile leaf at a time. And with each technological leap, we're not just uncovering lost stories. We're rewriting the very way we remember. These 26 vanished manuscripts aren't just gaps on a shelf, they're fractures in the spine of history itself. Each missing page is a thread snipped from the tapestry of human experience, leaving us to stumble over the snarled remnants. Think of all we've lost: a king's deathbed confession that could have rewritten a dynasty's legacy, the herbal knowledge of women branded as witches, the heliocentric theories that might have spared centuries of scientific stagnation. These weren't merely books, they were conversations cut short, ideas interrupted, voices silenced before they could finish their sentences. What makes their absence so haunting is how it warps our understanding of progress. We like to imagine history as a straight line, primitive to modern, ignorant to enlightened. But these manuscripts prove it's more like a labyrinth, with corridors collapsed and stairways leading nowhere. The Black Death merchant's diary could have taught us how societies rebuild after catastrophe. The Baltic pagan chronicles might have revealed a spirituality woven into the very trees and rivers. Without them, we're left with half-truths and caricatures, like trying to reconstruct a symphony from a single violin's echo. Yet there's hope in the hunt. Every decade, technology pulls another ghost from the shadows, palimpsests decoded by ultraviolet light, shipwrecks yielding wax-sealed letters, even AI reassembling fragments thought forever scattered. In 2012, a scholar in Barcelona discovered a scrap of vellum used as a bookmark, 7 words from the missing Crown of Aragon treaty, confirming its existence. 7 words, that's all it took to prove we're not chasing myths. These manuscripts are out there, hidden in plain sight, tucked into attic ledgers, pressed between prayer books, or buried beneath centuries of dust and denial. So here's the challenge they leave us with. How do we measure what we don't know? For every vanished text we mourn, how many others disappeared without leaving even a whisper in the records? The past isn't some static diorama behind glass, it's alive, shifting with each discovery and reinterpretation, supporting archivists, advocating for open access to collections, even transcribing old family papers. These aren't just acts of preservation. They're acts of defiance against time's erosion, a refusal to let more voices fade into silence. The next great historical revelation might be sitting in your local library's uncatalogued stack, or in a flea market's bargain bin disguised as junk. It could be the key to understanding a forgotten plague remedy, a lost artistic technique, or even an entire civilization's untold story. That's the thrill of history, not just studying what survives, but imagining what might still emerge. So keep looking, keep questioning, because the most electrifying words ever written might not be behind us. They could be waiting, ink barely dry after 500 years, for someone bold enough to turn the page.